Hello everyone and welcome to the CIH podcast. I'm joined by Justin, who is our National Director in Northern Ireland, Matt, our Director in Wales, Callum, our Director in Scotland, and Rachael, who heads up our policy and public affairs in England. So we're going to have a Four Nations look back at last year, the year in housing, and also then start to have a think about what might be coming up over the course of the next year. 2022 was the latest in a succession of pretty miserable years, it's felt like. Hot on the heels of COVID, we've had a cost of living crisis. We've had, I think it's fair to say, political chaos with potentially more prime ministers and housing ministers in a year, probably for the first time ever. I'd need to go back over and have a look at that, but we certainly had three prime ministers, a multitude of ministerial changes as well. And then towards the back end of the year as well, the housing sector has again found itself under the media spotlight with issues around quality and the tragic death of Iwab Ishak, which has brought into sharp focus the importance of having good quality, high quality social housing and high levels of customer service. So with all of those things in mind, Rachael, if I perhaps can come to you first, because I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that quality has been at the top of your agenda for much of the last year. And if you can just let us know where things are on the quality front.
Thanks, James. So for anyone who's not been following so closely, CIH, together with NHF, the National Housing Federation, commissioned an independent review back in summer 2022 to look at kind of quality and trust in social housing. That was led by Helen Baker, who's chair of trustees at Shelter, and a really good panel of people with lived and working experience of social housing. And that review concluded just before Christmas. The report's available on the website. If anyone wants to just Google it, you'll see it, called Better Social Housing Review. But in essence, they came up with 7 recommendations, which we're now looking at together with partners in the sector. Perhaps it's helpful if I just quickly run through the headlines of them. So that was every housing association and indeed the sector as a whole should refocus on their core purpose and deliver against it. That housing associations should work together to conduct and publish a thorough audit of all social housing in England. That housing associations should partner with tenants, contractors and frontline staff to develop and apply new standards defining what an excellent maintenance and repairs process looks like. That CIH should promote the traditional housing officer role as a supported and valued employment opportunity with the CIH recognised programme of training and continuing development. Nearly there. Housing associations should work with all tenants to ensure they have a voice and influence at every level of decision making across the organisation through both voluntary and paid roles. A housing association should develop a proactive local community presence through community hubs which foster greater multi-agency working. And then just to make sure that's happening, that housing associations should support tenants and frontline staff to undertake an annual review of the progress each organisation is making in implementing the review's recommendations. So there's a lot there. I think it's worth saying that Helen, who when she presented some of the findings to people, said was keen to stress there's a lot of really good practice that the review panel saw when they were out and about talking to people, to providers, to tenants, to stakeholders. Lots of good stuff, but clearly, the reason behind commissioning the reviews because we knew there were some issues to be looking at and working together on, and that review report seeks to pull them together. And almost some of the most simple ones are actually the most challenging when you think through what it means, and there's a lot going on. So we're just doing some work now to think about it in the context of the proactive consumer regulation framework that's obviously coming as the social housing bill passes.
Thank you. And the report and the recommendations have been characterised as something of a back to basics approach, really, haven't they, Rachel? Which so does that indicate that organisations have lost their focus on some of those basics?
Well, it was certainly a reminder, I think, in the reviews report that recognising the context, which is always really important, that as government grant has fallen away over the years and providers have had to do more and more to, with different projects, new development, lots of cross subsidy, perhaps with mergers, range of different challenges when you think about decarbonisation, cost of living, building safety. The pressures of all of that combined has, I think, at times felt clearly for tenants, as it came through in the review, that some of that basics of I've got an issue, I want to raise it with my provider, I want to speak to someone and I want to see that it's sorted, hasn't followed through. And we've seen that obviously in extreme cases. And so that going back to making sure that there is a really clear line of sight, I suppose, that tenants recognise the system to follow, that people feel comfortable and confident that they will be heard, irrespective of who you are, because there were issues flagged within the report as well around racial inequality that we need to be clearly looking at. There's some uncomfortable stuff in there, but we need to face into it together. Equally, though, there's a lot of best practice being highlighted, and we want to understand that so we can share it, not just for housing associations in England, but for the sector as a whole. And obviously that reaches across to UK housing.
And on that point about UK housing, so we've got the oldest and the least energy efficient housing stock in Europe, and I think it would be naive to think that issues around quality are solely restricted to England. And although the report and the panel's recommendations apply to housing associations in England, presumably there will be some read across in the other nations of the UK. Matt, can I come to you first then? I'm just trying to get a sense of how this is playing out in the other nations of the UK.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it would be flippant of us, wouldn't it, in the other jurisdictions, not to say that we need to take note of this and look at what that means for our own jurisdictions and the sector in our respective countries. So I think we're looking at it as an opportunity here in Wales. So we're already having discussions. I'm already in discussions with key stakeholders, Community Housing Cymru, Welsh Local Government Association, and other key actors within the sector, and we're going to get together in a couple of weeks to sort of look at the recommendations and see how we sort of approach them and respond to them in the Welsh context. But I think it's important to say that it is differently nuanced in Wales. We're not under the media glare that you guys have been in England, but that doesn't mean we rest on our laurels. Clearly, there's going to be issues of damp and mould within homes across Wales, and there has been some media highlighting of it. But there's an opportunity for us here to sort of take that proactive approach, take the responsibility on ourselves to look at how we can sort of implement some of these recommendations within the Welsh context. So we're working with organisations, we're working with the government, speaking to the head of regulation today about how we can sort of work some of these responses up. So I think that's the general response here in Wales, and how that sort of feeds into other priorities, because I think one thing to say is that actually a lot of this is wider than just damp and mould is the other thing to say. It's about standards of housing in general, and we've got legislation here, but actually there's a wider aspect here about improving our homes, and particularly around that decarb agenda and that retrofit agenda. Because if we do that retrofit work, if we made it a central part of our policy approach across all 4 jurisdictions, then I think we improve our homes substantially, not only in terms of standards, but fuel, tackling fuel poverty, etc., and that wider piece. So I think a massive opportunity here for us to be proactive in Wales, and ultimately the solutions are going to be pretty much the same, because I think Wales has probably got the oldest and least fuel efficient stock in Britain, and every other biggest in Europe. So yeah, lots of parallels to be drawn.
Thanks, Matt. Callum, does the report have much pickup in Scotland?
So yeah, absolutely. When England sneezes, Scotland and other devolved nations catch a cold. So absolutely, we are kind of mindful of it, and it's made landlords in the sector think about actually what does our stock look like. Now we've got a different process, got different standards. We've got a pretty engaged tenant participation process in Scotland. It's been, and I think has worked very successfully over quite a number of years. But this has absolutely drawn up concerns, and it has shone a light on perhaps where standards and practice hasn't been perhaps as high as we'd want it to be, and it's helpful to learn, and actually we don't see kind of tragedies that happened in Rochdale kind of mirror elsewhere in the UK. What I think is interesting though is I think there's a lead from the sector on this, but there isn't that lead from the government. I suppose I always think about the housing sector, there's probably 3 core areas. There's a bit around quality and standards, there's a bit around supply, and there's a bit around affordability. And in Scotland, you saw the sector interested in the point around standards, and we're seeing that in response to that. But the government, it's all about affordability. It's all about affordability. It's all about the cost of living crisis. It's about the kind of rent controls that have been applied to the sector in Scotland, but will be relieved for the social sector from April onwards. But then that leaves that third bit on supply, which almost because we're focusing so much on those other 2 areas, I think we're falling short on. And I think our ambitions in Scotland, while we have delivered a lot of affordable and social housing over the last few years, we're not going to see that. We're not going to be, because of inflation, because of other focuses on existing customers, which is understandable. I just don't see realistically how we will meet the ambition for 110,000 affordable homes by 2032. It's not going to happen.
Thanks, Callum. And we're starting to touch on some of the issues that we'll perhaps turn to after this. But Justin, keen to complete the picture really and get a sense of how applicable you think some of the recommendations are to the social housing sector in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, James, about read across. I would say housing in Northern Ireland retains good connections with communities and good accountability, themes that sometimes circle quality issues. But if we're honest, some homes will and do have issues. Any home with a cold surface is a candidate for condensation and mould growth, for example. So I think absolutely. There's a review of the regulatory framework for housing associations currently underway, and CIH is on the stakeholder reference group for that review. And one thing that we're pushing for there is that the framework needs to be enhanced to incorporate professionalism. An education requirement for housing managers under the consumer standard would be a good place to start, I think. Rachel referenced the developments in the Social Housing Regulation Bill for England, where the Secretary of State there has been given the power to direct the regulator to establish that standard for housing managers. And it seems to me that that's a sensible measure, one that not just the Northern Ireland regulator should look at, but potentially other regulators as well, if those kind of measures aren't already in place. And then, of course, we've got the findings of the Better Social Housing Review as well, which we're highlighting as part of that process. So, yeah, absolutely. I think there's read across and definitely room for improvement for the regulator in Northern Ireland.
Thanks all for that. And I think, and what I wanted to do next was start to be a little bit more kind of future focused and think about quality, but also thinking about some of the other challenges that we face as a sector across the UK, particularly in the context of the fact that we're likely to be having a general election in 2024. And, I guess that could be as early as May, couldn't it? May 2024, something like that. Normally have elections at that time of year. So we're not a million miles away from kind of entering into the whole period of electioneering, and it feels as though the main political parties are already going to be starting to grapple with what can go in their manifestos in a world where there isn't exactly a magic money tree. So there's going to be some tough decisions, I think, for the major political parties, and it's going to be interesting to see where housing may or may not feature in some of those manifestos. So, Rachel, perhaps if I come to you thinking about those manifestos, have we got a wish list? What do we think is achievable? What do we think are the areas of housing policy that government or that whoever wins the election should be focused on?
Yeah, I think we have quite a long wish list, don't we? And I think housing, from our point of view, obviously should be very much at the top of the agenda. But actually, interestingly, both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer gave quite big speeches in the last week in which housing wasn't really mentioned. So we've perhaps got a job to do to get it on the agenda, although I'm slightly encouraged by Alistair Campbell in the Rest is Politics podcast, which I'm a big fan of. There's a little plug for another podcast talking about the fact that it really ought to be higher up the agenda. I mean, interestingly, when we look back on some of the manifesto asks we've made over the years, they've not really changed much because there's some really big stuff that we haven't seen coming through yet. But certainly when you look at the housing census data that came through in the last week from ONS, you see how the shift arguably in the wrong direction in terms of housing tenure just speaks again to the importance of building more social housing, and really obviously a lot of kind of urgent probably policy intervention around local housing allowance. You look at some of the stats that Shelter have been releasing around the number of people, children, 1 in 100 children living in temporary accommodation was a stat released just before Christmas, because there is just not enough affordable housing for people to live in. So there's not enough social housing. That means the private rented sector obviously picks up the strain, and then the private rented sector has its own issues. Quite a lot of stuff in the press at the moment about landlords exiting the market for all sorts of different reasons. So that all that does is put up prices and puts up pressure. That needs an intervention from government. Some of the things that we might want to do, sometimes arguably you don't need government to intervene on, but there's some big stuff there in terms of supply in the longer term. But in the immediate term, looking at some of the levers around, for example, local housing allowance, which doesn't reflect the cost of renting. So we saw some good stuff in the autumn statement last year, the uprating of benefits in line with inflation this April, which is good, although it doesn't still get away from the cuts that were baked in from previous non-inflationary rises. But the lack of kind of action on local housing allowance is a real biggie. And I know that's challenging when, back to your point about no magic money tree, but it's such an opportunity cost, isn't it? When we're not building more housing, all we're doing is seeing rents go up, and then more and more people can't afford them, ultimately end up homeless, housing temporary accommodation, and all sorts of costs to the system. So some of the wider stuff we see around health and social care, life chances. The bigger infrastructure stuff is really fundamental, and housing, I think, more and more is being seen as the heart of the problem and the solution. And we'd really hope to see that, coming through in manifesto. I mean, interestingly, just having a quick look at some of the stuff that Labour has put out, because we haven't seen anything yet, as far as I know, from the Conservatives. They've got some kind of 5 headline themes for their consultations as they work up their manifesto asks. And housing comes under the banner of a future where families come first. That within that looks at housing and social security and makes commitments to, talks about council building, but I'm assuming we can read across to social housing and making sure the welfare system really does act as a support for people. We'd obviously want to be supportive of that, but our sort of 3 headline themes, I think, that we've worked at before, would be our same strategic ask. So the right homes in the right places, that people on low incomes can access and maintain a decent home, and that everyone has access to a decent, safe place to call home, and renters, irrespective of where they rent, receive a fair quality service from their landlord. They're 3 quite basic asks, but I think we'd be looking to hang our specific policy asks underneath them. And we're working at the moment on our submission ahead of the 15th of March budget to reflect on that. So starting to think ahead, certainly to manifesto, but I think there's a lot to do before that point.
Justin, if I come to you, how prominently is housing likely to feature in the political discourse in Northern Ireland in the run up to a general election?
In terms of a general election, probably not as highly as it should do. I think my big fear with the general election is that, I mean, you mentioned political chaos. We have our very own brand of political chaos that Westminster seem to be trying its hardest to replicate. I don't recommend that. It's good to see some stability back in the system. But in terms of over here, we have no executive, which means no new policy. Civil servants are more or less facilitating the status quo, which is a problem when you need to take action and reform to support the housing sector, housing development, quality issues, all the things that we've discussed. So, I mean, not having an executive at any time is a disgrace, but certainly so during a cost of living crisis where you've got acute pressures on the health system and indeed pressures in housing and the homelessness sectors. And, it's an uncertainty that housing professionals don't need. I think Brexit and the Northern Ireland Protocol is the latest axis upon which Northern Ireland's political stability is teetering. So, as I say, my fear is that those issues pervade and become the stars of the show in the run up to a general election. Then all the other important stuff takes a back seat. But I mean, things look positive. I mean, we have the UK government taking a pragmatic approach around that. I saw Labour come out today in support of that as well. So it looks like any measure might have the numbers in Westminster. And, the hope would be that issue is then put to bed, so then we can give appropriate focus to housing issues. And some of those, Rachel touched on those. One of the strengths, I think, of CIH as a UK-wide organisation is that we can be vocal on issues, say, around welfare, which of course is a UK-wide issue. We can highlight those. We can highlight that, and then other issues that are important to us, and the principles tend to travel across nations around things like net zero and building safety issues as well.
Callum, though, same issues in Scotland. Is there anything beyond what we've talked about that you think is likely or should feature in a debate around housing?
And I agree with Justin for the context in Scotland. It's a devolved housing for the most part. It's devolved outside the welfare points that Justin's just mentioned. So for the most part, we won't have a detailed debate on housing in a Scottish context, apart from rightly kind of LHA rates have a huge impact, and the lack of money in that obviously has a big effect on the number of homes people get. I think that the housing will be part of the broader discussion in Scotland. It's about that economic stewardship, that kind of stability, how you catalyse growth, how obviously if there's spending on housing and the Barnett consequentials that may feed through Scotland to allow the Scottish government to make its own decision. But I think that's ultimately got that kind of case around economic competence and how the next government can address cost of living in a meaningful way. We all know housing is the big part. It's a huge part of that. We've got so much evidence reports that shows that it's one of the kind of main instruments to alleviate poverty, and it's an incredibly effective, and it's a a great catalyst for public-private kind of partnerships. You've got and you can build it everywhere and anywhere across the country. We all know it does that, and I think if there was that recognition and within England and the kind of the next UK government, it would have a hugely beneficial effect for all the devolved nations, because we'd see that not just that narrative but the money come through. But as part of the campaign, it won't be part of it. It will be it'll be that broader cost of living economic stewardship, and if we're lucky, I think as Rachel pointed out, it's just not getting picked up by the party leaders now. In a devolved nations context, I don't think that'll change.
Matt, if we can bring you in here then to reflect on what we've heard and to have a think about how things might play out in Wales.
Well, it needs to be top of the agenda, doesn't it? Housing across the whole UK. I mean, 34 kids have died in temporary accommodation since 2019, the National Child Mortality Database report today, with a direct causal link between living in temporary accommodation and the cause of death. I mean, why that doesn't drive the issue of housing and good housing to be in the top 2 or 3 of any debate in the general election is astounding. And as Rachel said, the fact that the 2 leaders of the main political parties didn't mention housing really in their big New Year pitches is just astounding. So that falls on us as an organisation, that falls on us as a sector to push it. In Wales, our response to that has been a campaign that we've been running with partners over the last several years for the incorporation of a right to adequate housing into Welsh law as the key stick to make that paradigm change and push housing up that agenda. If young children haven't got a right to housing, then how can they progress? And if 34 of them are dying, then we are really in a bad situation. And we knew that even before these statistics came down. But you drill down to that, and it's about increasing supply, isn't it, ultimately? But I think whichever government comes into power has a real problem, as Karen was alluding to. The cost of living crisis is the only thing that governments are focused on, or parties or certain parties, and that sort of paradox between solving the here and now. So we have things like the local housing allowance. Only 2% of homes in Wales are below or at the local housing allowance level, and that's we're already at a cliff edge there, and that's July figures last year. So it's only got worse, with more PRS landlords vacating the sector and rents going up, increasing, and that's across the UK. So there's that short-term crisis that's coming, that ultimately the new government's going to have to look at in terms of welfare. So that direction of money and investment into that short-term cost of living issue means that you have less money to invest in actually what the real solution to all of this is: increasing supply at the pace and scale that we need to. So it's a difficult one to square, and ultimately we need to do it all. But I think there's short-term cliff edges that are coming up, as I just mentioned, that we probably need to sort of focus on, and that's around welfare. But yeah, supply, etc., and standards. But like I was saying in the previous discussion about the report, I think ultimately, if we start focusing in on creating sustainable homes through retrofit and improving the standard of our homes that way, then a lot of these other issues fall into place, because our cost benefit analysis that we did as part of the right to adequate housing campaign demonstrated that a lot of the investment is about upgrading the homes, retrofit to better EPC standards, and that addresses health issues, it addresses sustainability issues, etc., and fuel poverty. So I think that's where the sort of collection of all those issues can come together under one roof, and we can tackle all of them with that investment. But again, where's the money coming from? I mean, the Welsh budget is now worth £1 billion less than it was when the spending round was announced 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've articulated it superbly there, Matt. And I suppose the other challenge that we have as a sector is how we create the space to have that debate on housing. It feels to me as though the future of the health service is probably going to be close to the top of the list at the next general election. And I think we all know from the jobs that we do that the links between health and housing are absolutely fundamental, and that at least one of the solutions to the health crisis that we find ourselves in is to have better housing outcomes for people. There's that sort of basic tenet that if people are well housed, they are generally healthy. But there's also issues around people moving on from hospital, how we get people out of hospital into independent living. So I think there's an opportunity for us to frame the debate, at least in part, around that challenge that we face over the future of the health service, and hopefully we can push housing up the agenda and get leaders of major political parties talking about it in the run up to a general election. As always with these things, we could probably talk for hours and hours, but I'm conscious that we're probably not far off time now. So I wondered if I could be a bit naughty and put everyone on the spot. If perhaps I could, in turn, come to you all for just what would be your wish for housing in 2023, and it could be very specific to the nation in which you work, or it could be something more general. I don't want you to be constrained by the sort of constraints that governments might be around money and around ambition. So anyone want to kick us off with that?
I'm going to be a bit boring and say lower inflation as something for the immediate term. Last year was a very tough year. Housing practitioners trying to get repairs and improvements done with fewer contractors and all the difficulties around that. I would say maybe some reform to our procurement framework to promote more agile responses to some of those issues. We do have quite a bureaucratic framework here that housing professionals work underneath, but I do think that if we can tackle that runaway inflation and all the kind of impact that has on housing delivery and quality issues, that would be my ask.
Rachel?
Well, I'd echo that, but I'd also say, in an ideal world, wouldn't it be great to have a cross-party housing strategy? It feels like so many of the issues we've got are because it's short-term politics. And even within a party, when you started in your opening, James, talking about the amount of political change we saw last year, I was reading a book in the week that said actually in the past 3 decades, there's been more stability in the England football manager role than the position of housing and planning minister, which is quite shocking when you think of it. So 5 housing and planning ministers last year. No wonder the sector is struggling to work out what it's doing, set against a backdrop of inflationary pressures and all the other stuff we've alluded to. So wouldn't it be great if you could get the parties to come together and set out a vision for where we're trying to go to with housing, in the same way that I know they've done on social care, but then doesn't always get followed through. So if we're saying in an ideal world of utopia where we can wave our magic wand, I'd say politicians working together to set a really clear long-term vision that people can get behind and then go away and deliver on, then maybe we could look back and see the supply and the quality coming through that we need.
Decades of failure and a poisoned chalice. So we could be talking about the England football manager or a housing and planning minister. So that's quite a nice little touch. Matt?
I'm going to be slightly naughty. I have 2 quick ones, if I may. I think the first hope is that
very quick then
an incoming government raises the LHA rate immediately, because I think the impact that's having and the short-term impact that's going to have and make the crisis more acute. I think that needs to be addressed immediately. But kind of what I was alluding to previously, I think the next Westminster government understanding the centrality of housing a bit more, and whether that's possible given the other barriers and impacts that are happening at the moment around cost of living. But that idea about how housing can play that massively central role in decarbonisation of our society, about how housing can play a central role in taking pressure off the NHS, about housing can do all this around providing better life chances, etc. And whether that has to be done through legislation, I don't know, but that would be my hope. I mean, lots of politicians talk about it being a right and a human right, but it just simply isn't. And like I say, when we get children dying because they haven't got decent housing, then we need to do something about it.
Callum?
Save the best to last. I'm going to be incredibly on message and talk about housing professionalism, because I honestly think in Scotland we've got a brilliant 20-year strategy for the sector. So when you're talking about, Rachel, what you want, Scott, I think we've got a wonderful strategy. It talks about how amazing the built environment for housing could be, but it has nothing about housing professionals. It has nothing about succession planning, nothing about bringing people into the workforce, nothing about standards, nothing about CPD. And I think some of the work that's going on in England actually is absolutely leading the UK in this. So I want to see that. I want to see a more recognition in Scotland, particularly, about housing professionalism, so that when we talk about workforce challenges, we talk about teachers, talk about nurses, talk about doctors. Actually, housing professionals are absolutely part of that. You know, we see strain all across the sector. There are, you know, there'll be pay disputes all across the UK, even people leaving the sector because they feel getting paid the salary that they deserve. So we need to have that focus, and I repeat myself. I think England is taking a lead in this, and I'd like to see Scotland kind of step up to that and have our focus on housing professionals and professionals matched, I think, the really positive vision we've got for the built environment.
Thank you all very much. What a pragmatic bunch you all are. I didn't think there was anything in those wishes that a really determined government couldn't deliver. So that's a little bit of a note of optimism for us to finish up on. So thank you all very much for that. 2023 is going to be a big year. It's going to be a big year for housing. It's going to be a big year for the nation at large, and we'll continue to cover the various aspects of housing policy over the course of 2023. So thank you all very much for joining me today.